Hi there. I'm Nancy Cerrone, and I'm from Lovell, Wyoming, and I am with the Pryor Mountain Wild Mustang Center. And today I wanted to share with you some information regarding the Pryor Mountain Wild Horse Range Joint Management Area Plan, the JMAP. It was issued by the BLM on April 10th, and it will with a comment period, a public comment period that will last until May 15th. So I am just here to help you maybe gain some understanding of that plan. Let's get started. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about the BLM regulatory process and how they have certain what they call tiers, or I call it alignment of practice of both regulation and practice. So with it started back with the Wild Horse and Burro Act. I think it was enacted in about 1971-ish, sometime in there, with the sole idea to protect and manage wild horses and achieve and maintain a thriving natural ecological balance in the herd management areas. We're very proud of the fact that the Pryor Mountain Wild Horse Range was the first federally protected public wild horse range, and it led the way to this Wild Horse and Burro Act later, a few years later. So the Wild Horse and Burro Act introduced this idea of AML, which stands for Appropriate Management Level, and we'll talk more about that as we go into this deeper. Then there's the next step is the range management plan. The last one was written in 2015, and it still applies today. The range management plan, it provides regulatory guidance for the whole BLM area that is managed by the Billings BLM Field Office. It's a large area, of which the Pryor Mountains are a piece of that whole management area. The range management plan then defines, it gives some overall guidance on how to manage the wild horses. And then the next step of that is what's called a JMAP, or in the past it's been an HMAP, which the HMAP stands for Herd Management Area Plan. For some reason, with this new one that's being written, they're calling it Joint Management Area Plan. I don't understand why, but it's the same basic premise that it provides the actions, it defines the actions that they will take to implement the criteria as defined in the range management plan. I'm in the school system, and it reminds me of how we operate, that we have policy. The policy guides us, guides our decision making, guides our processes, but the policy isn't actionable. In order to make things actionable, then we have certain handbooks and guidebooks that define the various components of the school system. It's the same way as I view this BLM regulatory process as well. So I'm going to continue with that to build understanding of what's happening right now. That the scoping notice is what was released on April 10th, right in there. I believe that was the date. And what the scoping notice does is it just is a preliminary report that says, here's what we're looking at right now in order to develop a final joint management area plan. And there's steps involved from this first step all the way to this step. And it goes like this. So right now we're in a public comment period. So as a public, we have the right to read through the scoping notice and submit comments, and also maybe plan for alternatives within our comments. The next step then is that it's an environmental assessment of either the JMAP or the HMAP. And they take these comments, they synthesize them, put together into another document, the environmental assessment, that goes back to the public for comment, I believe another 30-day review. Based on that, the BLM will write the final JMAP, and if it goes like other processes I'm aware of, there would be an appeal process at that point as well. So you can see there's good opportunity for public comment right now. And what the BLM asks for is substantial comments. They, and by that, I assume it means something like well-informed, based on fact, and targeted on the intent of the plan. This isn't the place to really get into emotional or personal things, although you can add a little personal element to just introduce why you are writing your comments. It certainly doesn't hurt for them to hear a little bit of the story and why you're writing these comments. So today I just am hoping that the information I give you will allow you to write these substantial comments. So we're going to begin with AML. AML, appropriate management level, is really such an important guideline for the BLM in their management of the wild horses. The Wild Horse and Burro Act defines AML as the number of wild horses that can thrive in balance with other public land resources and uses. The range management plan also provides a definition, and they say it's the maximum amount of wild horses the range can sustain while preventing deterioration. The JMAP then takes those definitions and they define steps on how they're going to achieve and maintain AML. And just for your knowledge, that in the priors, the AML is a range from 90 at the low end to 120 at the high end. The components of the JMAP, and by the way, you can find this document. I put a link to it on our Mustang Center Facebook page, so you can certainly find that and just link onto it. And it really does serve as the activity level management plan for the Pryor Mountain Joint Management Area. And it has 3 levels of objectives. One is, what are the overall management objectives? The next step is monitoring. How are we going to monitor those management objectives? And the third step is, how do we implement them? So this, as I said before, the plan defines how they will manage the prior horses to AML. In the plan, it calls it, this statement comes right out of the plan as well, and it says, the plan will establish short-term and long-term management objectives for the wild horse herd and their habitat. And I ask you to consider this. These are my way of thinking about long-term and short-term. With long-term, it's the long-term future of the prior horses. I'd love to know that the prior horses are going to be here, when my grandchildren have children. That long-term future of the prior horses. And then the short term, it's more thinking about the health and the safety of the current population of prior horses. And some management considerations to go along with this. These things I feel are foundational. I would like to see them maybe in the introductory section of the JMAP, that they define these considerations that are very important when considering the management. First off, the prior horses are definitely of cultural, historical, and scientific importance. Their cultural, historical legacy from the Spanish to the Native Americans to the cowboy in this area is just a piece of the Western history that needs to be preserved. Scientifically, there's some importance with the early paleo horses that actually have been dug from a cave, just some of which have been dug from a cave just right outside of Lovell, just with, viewing distance from the priors. These also, the other consideration is, as I said before, these are the first federally protected public herd of wild horses, and it led the way for the Wild Horse and Burro Act. The prior horses are of a strong economic importance for Montana and Wyoming, very much so in this area of Wyoming, where so many people come to Lovell just to see the horses. That's a consideration. They have been linked genetically to the Spanish horses. That goes along with that historical significance. The priors are a small closed herd. The gene pool is, the entire gene pool is represented by the current horses on the range. Right now, I'd say the range is about 168 total horses, but as far as the breeding population, I think it's right around 154-ish, something like that. There is a problem with these small isolated populations, that they tend to be at a higher risk in this word environmental stochastic event. I'm not sure how to say that, but that just means those random environmental events. For example, in 1978, there was just a horrific winter, and the horse population was reduced to 87 during that time. That's difficult for small populations, and the Pryor horses luckily were able to rebound and continue to thrive in the Pryors. But it is harder to maintain genetic diversity within a small population, and that's why it strongly needs to be considered in a management plan. On page 1 of the guide there of the preliminary JMAP is a statement that I put a star because I think it is one of the most important statements in the document. It says, due to monitoring and documentation of the Pryor Mountain wild horses, management within the Pryor Mountain Wild Horse Range JMA, Joint Management Area, can be more specialized than that of most BLM management areas. And this is such an important thing. This idea of monitoring and documentation is so true, that these horses, they are monitored by a number of people, including us and including the Mustang Center throughout the last 50 years, and then documenting them. We've maintained a list for forever of the horses, the bands, the ages, the birth dates, just you name it, we have documentation of it. And this information is available to the BLM to help provide this more specialized type of plan than of the areas that don't have this level of monitoring and documentation that the Pryor Mountain horses have. Getting into 2 main management objectives from the range management plan. Basically, it says you manage the horses and you manage the land. And with the horses, there's a couple bullet points that talk about managing the horses, and I can quickly read those to you, although we're going to get into them later also. The manage the land piece, I'm going to just put that on hold right now because I do talk about it later. But managing the horses, the RMP has an objective to maintain a wild horse herd that exhibits a diverse age structure, genetic diversity, and any characteristics unique to the Pryor horses. And following that, it talks more about herd characteristics. It says, within an HMAP, herd structure will be managed for all representations in the herd, not allowing specific colors or bloodlines to dominate from management manipulation. So keep an eye on I'll be talking more about this. In fact, it's coming right now. Let's go back to the first objective, manage the horses. Maintain a wild horse herd that exhibits a diverse age structure, genetic diversity, and any characteristics unique to the Pryor horses. So those two phrases that I highlighted in blue, genetic diversity and characteristics unique to the Pryor horses, really talk about 2 different thoughts on management. One is to manage through a genotype. The genotype are any genetic characteristics or makeup of any kind of an organism, and as opposed to the phenotype. The phenotype are observable characteristics. So if you think of a horse, anything about that horse that you can see is the phenotype. And now what I want to show you, though, if you look at this big circle of genetic makeup and think of it, this entire organism, let's just say a horse, with that genetic makeup, it determines those observable characteristics. The phenotype is dependent on the genetic makeup, as are, the non-observable characteristics, the things inside the horse that make the horse different and unique. And that's all part of the genetic makeup. It's important to realize this how these fit together, that the phenotype is not separate from the genotype for the most part. So, and we continue this idea of managing the horses and genotype and phenotype once again. I have to warn you, this slide gets a little bit messy, so just bear with me and I'll try to get us through it. So the RMP items I'm putting in blue, and the RMP again, it talked about genetic diversity and it talked about bloodlines, both which are within the genotype, the genetic characteristics of an organism. And the genetic diversity, how do you figure? There's a couple ways to figure that out. One of them, you can monitor it and document the horse history. And this is where we talked earlier about the large amount of documentation of this herd, that we do have a pretty extensive lineage chart that can really give solid information on the genetic diversity and the bloodlines of the wild horses. You can also determine genetic diversity through a DNA analysis. There's in the JMAP, uh, the BLM talked about using hair follicles to determine the genetic diversity and other genetic material samples, such as fecal sampling. And there's actually a plan right now to do a DNA analysis through fecal sampling that we're a part of. And and we really encourage the BLM to continue with that one because it is less intrusive to the horses than collecting hair follicles from the different horses. Um, and and also, I think that the use of, say, fecal sampling for DNA analysis really is helpful when we talk about this document. We have the lineage charts because I think it would really support that, and especially for the stallions, even though we do have a chart on the stallion lineages, it's a little, it's a little more iffy. The certainty just isn't there as it is with mares. In addition, the JMAP talks about breeding capacity, and I'm going to talk about that later. Let's go to phenotype. The RMP, again, it talked about characteristics unique to Pryor horses and color. And the JMAP changed the word unique and put it typical. It 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 loosely means the same thing, although I prefer the word unique because they are so unique to the Pryor horses, and I believe it should be recognized that way as a unique characteristic. Either way, both of them refer to conformation. Conformation is just basically the body structure of the horse. And if you want to know more about these characteristics unique to the Pryor horses, go to the Pryor Mountain Wild Mustang Center webpage. There is a section on color and conformation of the Pryor horses. The JMAP talks about inherited conditions. We'll talk about that briefly in a little while. It also talks about body condition. Body condition, while it is an observable characteristic, it can be related to the genetics in that some horses are a little bit more lightly built, and so they tend to look thinner, or that their body condition isn't as strong. But body condition is so often determined by seasonal changes on the horse range. So we really favor the use of genetic management, and that genetic management, if done correctly, will take care of a lot of the conformation and color, the phenotypical characteristics. Because if you're managing for this group of Pryor horses, which is essentially a breed, and they're all pretty typey up there, there's not a lot that have non-typical conformation, so they're all pretty typey, so chances are you're going to continue to get strong conformation. And as far as color actually isn't really associated there is no specific color strongly associated with Spanish Mustangs. And so again, if you keep some genetics going, you're going to see color variations occurring, such as what we have this spring again with little Unity, who's just this bright little red color, a horse born to a blue roan mare and a Grullo stallion. So her color came out despite what you would expect from her parents' phenotype. Back to genetic management again, that it really is dependent on an adequate number, an adequate population size to maintain the genetics. if I was here with you now, I would certainly ask if there's any questions, but if you do have questions, you can always touch base with me later. Now, one of the things this JMAP talks about is bringing in other horses to increase genetic diversity. And I just found out today that something that's called genetic rescue, and it just means that you're going to take similar animals of the same species and introduce them into an area. And it really is done primarily with the endangered species with limited population size and evidence of inbreeding. Now, in the priors, this had been tried in the past, and it was not very successful. I think we need to really think about the past, the processes of the past, and say, okay, what can we learn from that as far as current and future practices? This genetic rescue does have potential to introduce negative unintended consequences. And I just invite you to go to the internet and read about genetic rescue and see when it is used and what can possibly happen. These prior horses are so well adapted to the land with a strong social system established. One of the consequences of this can be that it can disrupt this social system that has been established, and that can alter what the current status is. And I think most importantly, there is a way to manage and protect the current genetics of the herd. Sorry, I have a typo on that. And I just believe with a well thought out preventative proactive management plan, genetic rescue really shouldn't need to be used if other actions are taken to continue to maintain the genetic diversity of the priors. I'm going to go into this a little bit more with the genetic piece of it. You can see it's pretty important to me. Genetic diversity, if you look at this, right in the middle of this, that you see two circles. And basically, it is about population of the horses. And the outer ring, actually, it's not population, it's bloodlines as well as individuals. So the outer circle here is the gene pool as it used to be. And this represents the gene pool as it is today with the current population of horses. And you can see it has shrunk through time. And it shrunk due to limiting factors. One are the natural limiting factors, and the others are human limiting factors. So with natural limiting factors, things like weather, predation, natural mortality, they can cause death, and the death in time can reduce just of individuals and possibly bloodlines, can then reduce the genetic diversity. Human limiting factors, removals, has definitely caused a shrinking of the genetic diversity in the priors. And then fertility control, the same thing, has reduced the genetic diversity. Although removals it's significant, because once the horse is removed from the range, it has lost all chance of any kind of genetic contribution. Whereas fertility control has the option that may allow all the animals to contribute genetically, which is important for genetic diversity. On the other hand, there's some things that can cause the diversity to either be maintained or even increase a little, and one is through band interchange. Another is through range dispersal, which range dispersal then in turn can help with the band interchange, shake up the band, so to speak. So range dispersal just means that across this big 39,000 acres of the horse range, we have areas that are somewhat territorial for the animals, but you can at times see a mountain horse move to the dry head. Think about Niobrara, who was a mountain horse, and now she's on the dry head. So that helps with that band interchange, then shakes up the genes a little bit between the subherds of the range. And finally, on this slide, I took this blue overlay to just say the plan to manage the horses should consider genetic diversity in the priors and really carefully consider removals of individuals and fertility control to see how it is going to impact the genetic diversity. And that's basically a genetic management system. So let's take this into the context of the JMAP. These are statements that I pulled right out of the plan to talk about. First off, that this second to the last bullet here, remove excess animals through a selective removal criteria, that's really the overarching goal of these follow-up statements. So I'm gonna just take that one and just move it up where it should be at the top. So here's what they're going to be looking at. Wild horses that display good conformation and a variety of colors will be selected first to be placed back on the JMA, the Joint Management Area. So my thing is a little off there. Let me, oh, sorry, it doesn't matter. So selected first. What are they going to select first? Good conformation and a variety of colors to keep on the range. Now, that's, remember, that's phenotype. That's phenotypical management there. So their first criteria, selection removal criteria, is based on phenotype. The next one says, in keeping with wild horse management decisions from the 2015 RMP, maintain a mix of colors and bloodlines within the JMA, not allowing any specific color or bloodline to dominate. Then, maintaining all bloodlines will no longer be a management goal. That sentence right there is of concern. Number one, maintaining all bloodlines should be a management goal in order to best ensure genetic diversity. However, if you go back into the plan, into that statement right here, first of all, they took color and bloodline. So we have phenotype, genotype, color and bloodline mentioned in this. We're going to maintain a mix of this. Now, we're not going to allow any specific color or any bloodline to dominate. Now, without a maintenance of bloodlines and really understanding the bloodlines, how do you know which ones are dominating? Exactly with this next one as well. It says any individuals who are part of a dominant bloodline will be considered for removal. So again, that's looking at individual bloodlines, identifying which ones are dominant, and then taking out the individuals from that dominant bloodline. So again, this statement here, maintaining all bloodlines will no longer be a management goal, just seems inconsistent and inappropriate. The next one has to do with the genetic rescue that I talked about, which this sentence is a little bulky, so just stick with me on this. Stallions or mares may be from a different HMA, herd management area, but displaying similar or desired characteristics of the wild horses within the joint management area. And they may be released to maintain or increase the genetic diversity of the herd. So they're going to take stallions or mares from a different herd area. Yeah, they're going to have similar or desired characteristics of the wild horses, and they may be released to maintain or increase the genetic diversity of the herd. Again, I just ask you to consider the idea that there are better ways to maintain or increase the genetic diversity of the herd without doing something as intensive as bringing in different stallions and mares. The last one here is another concern, excess animals, which means any number of animals above AML will be removed to the low range of the AML upon determination that excess animals are present. So anytime the BLM says, you know what, there's too many animals, we're going to take it down to the low range. Remember, the low range is 90, so they can take it down to 90. This varies from the previous HMAP, the 2009 one, where it says manage to high end of the range of the AML range since fertility control is used. This is an area of concern that could be commented if you would agree on that. Now, I'm just briefly going to talk about fertility control. There's a lot in there, and I just don't have time right now to get deeply into the fertility control. But there is a statement on page 5 that actually is a good statement, and we'll star that one because it really has a good intent. It says, mares ages 4 and older would not receive a treatment until after they have successfully foaled. And we just really applaud that. This is it's an important change, because right now there's an age cap that when a mare reaches the age of 10, she immediately goes on to PZP, and she pretty much stays on it till she's 20. But the problem is, oftentimes those mares will not have reproduced yet, and so they have no chance to contribute genetically by having an offspring. However, so the intent of this is really good. There's just one piece that I would question, and in the 2009 HMAP, it says these mares would be allowed to successfully foal twice. The JMAP, this new one, says mares would not receive a treatment until after they have successfully foaled once. The idea of successful foaling is that the foal has lived past their first birthday. But there is a concern here and a caution, because that assumes that if a foal lives, if the horse lives past 1 year old, that they probably will live for, to be able to reproduce. But that isn't true. We've seen many cases in the past few years where stallions will die as a result of stallion battles. And so at that age, those stallions often will not have reproduced, so they die without genetic representation. And sometimes if that's the only one of a mare, then and she's been put on PZP, then she herself will also not have genetic representation on the range. So this is an issue that to address. Okay, this is a crazy busy slide, but just I'll attempt to go through what I'm talking about here. On page 6, they list other removal criteria, and there's 3 that I want to point out in this, starting with the 5th one, Objective 5, age structure. If you remember, the RMP said that they will manage for age structure. So what I've done is, this is a population pyramid. I do these every year in our field guide. You might recall seeing something like this, but I've color coded it for to match the age structure defined through the JMAP. So how this reads is, there's 4 age groups: young, middle, old, and very old. Provides their ages. And then this first percent here, 15 to 50%, means this is what the range of young horses the BLM would like to see, which currently this last number is 17%, which 17% of the horses right now are in this in the acceptable range. Same with the middle group, the old group, and the very old. I do think I have an error right here on this old one. I don't think this is 39%, so it would be, let me quickly, no, I can check that later, but it gives, you can look and see the idea of these old horses, any horse over 20, and notice we only have 2 stallions that are over 20. So then I want to jump up to Objective 3. Wild horses that are no longer breeding or have contributed genetically could be removed. This is a pretty big change from previous management criteria. So let's look at these. I put a blue overlay again right over these horses that could talk about. It says they're no longer breeding. Well, these are the mares that have been on PZP now, and you can see some of them have been on PZP a long time, and consequently they're non-reproductive. So, and then you get up into this really old group and they're non-reproductive, and then you think about, and that's just the horses no longer breeding. But then there's also the factor, the criteria that those that have contributed genetically could be removed. We'd even have a few of those down in this 4 to 9 age group. I think of Nova. Right now, she has several foals. She could be removed. Halcyon, is she in that same? Nope, Halcyon's up in here. She could be removed. Greta could be removed. So there's a number of horses of those mares that could be removed simply because they're um, they have already contributed genetically. Again, that is quite a change. Objective 4 does talk about display those inheritable conditions. These are horses that could have like hernias, or they call it parrot mouth or dwarfism, although I don't think there's any dwarfism that could be displayed, but I guess it's a possibility that those horses could be removed as well. Again, lots happening on this page, but the main thing is to really think about, in the context of this age structure, which horses could be removed because of their breeding status. So, and to just go on with a little bit more on that, in the past, the focus group for removal were the young horses, and decisions made on the number of siblings they have, or their bloodline, was it adequately represented, that type of thing. But this doesn't appear in the plan, and if somebody has seen that in there, please let me know. I'm just not finding it. The plan definitely seems to be looking at mares, and by that, older mares. Number one, older mares who are no longer breeding, and mares that have contributed genetically. And so the plan is to consider taking these horses off. But the caution on that, there is a caution. Number one, there's such a strong social structure in the Pryors, and often it's the older mares that really have the leadership, the wisdom, they help take care of and nurture the young. They are companions to the other mares, which gives stability to the bands. There's a lot of things going on in that social structure that removing those older mares, especially removing them quickly, could be problematic for the social structure of the herd. We've seen it before. If, say, a lead mare from a stallion dies, the band, they kind of they're more loosely organized. There's not that real tight bond that lead mare often provides. The second piece to this is just adoptability. You know, the young horses were suitable for adoption because people really liked getting them. They were trainable. They were just they adapted fairly well to a domestic setting. But if you've adopted older horses, there's some challenge to them. And right now there's such an excess of available wild horses for adoption that I really question how these could be adopted. I think it would have to be done very carefully. I think it would almost have to be pre-planned. Say if you're going to remove a horse like Aurora, who would want her immediately coming off the range? And that would, again, take a lot of coordination and effort to make it successful, so we're still able to provide them a safe and healthy life in a domestic setting. Something to think about. Just a brief, quick, short-term, say the health and safety of the horses. The plan just offers various gather methods that they might use. Bait and or water trapping is one. Helicopter drive trapping, and whatever helicopter assisted roping is. I just have red flagged both of the helicopter ones simply because helicopters have been used in the Pryors, and it's difficult, it's stressful, it can cause injury, it can cause separation of bands. It's a difficult thing, and as I said, it's been tried in the past. It was replaced by the bait trapping, which has been much more successful. It's far less intrusive for the safety and health of the horses. I just would like to recommend that they continue with the bait trapping and leave the helicopters out of this. Lastly, I'm going to talk briefly about land management. Again, the RMP had a statement on the habitat, and it says maximize the amount of acres available for vegetation treatments and/or water developments that potentially increase forage availability for wild horses. That is compliant with other multiple use decisions and restrictions. I've highlighted in red the very important pieces of that, especially that to potentially increase forage availability. The JMAP plan, it definitely talks about the practices with the water developments, and which is needed because the water developments must be maintained. Earlier I had talked about range dispersal. The water developments really help disperse the horses across the range, which is great because then it's also dispersing their grazing practices. However, I don't see anything on the vegetation treatments to potentially increase forage availability. I really think it's an important part of this. I think, from what I've seen, the BLM will go and monitor the range conditions to a certain point. That is important, but it needs to be done very consistently and thoughtfully on when the optimal time of year to do the range evaluations are, or the optimal time is. And then also to say, okay, what are some ways that we could treat vegetation to get the forage more available to the horses? There've got to be some good options, and I think those need to be considered and developed as well. Well, that's it for now. If you have any questions, please contact me through Facebook Messenger is a quick and easy way to contact me, or you can email me at pryorwild@tctwest.net. I do appreciate your time, and I'm thankful that you're willing to possibly submit comments in response to this plan.